Hello. In this lesson, we'll go over cost centers. We're in Chapter 2 in the second section on, actually third section, cost centers on page 15 in the new client handbook. And here we can see the menu path for cost centers. It's under accounting, maintenance, cost centers. So I go to our program. Got accounting, maintenance, and cost centers. Now remember, the only thing we've done so far, we've established our checking account, we established our checking account, established our funds, and then we're adding cost centers. And we're doing this in this order because of the way account codes are structured in the township chart of accounts. Remember our chart of accounts. You can look back in the Accounting and General Manual under appendices for the township. And here we can see the township chart of accounts. We've got two components for revenues and appropriations. We've got the fund number and the revenue code. So for your sources of revenue, you'll have to identify a revenue code. And then appropriation program codes, you have three sets. You've got appropriation program codes and appropriation object codes. So with programs codes, this refers to where money is being spent, objects specifically on what it's being spent on. There's nothing here about costs regarding cost centers. Got a little very simple PowerPoint slide that I'm going to show you related to revenue and appropriations. Let me show you the full screen here. So for revenue accounts, when you're ultimately going to set up revenue account codes, and they'll include these three components. There are only two required components. The fund number, like for instance the general fund or the road and bridge fund for townships, and the revenue account code number, a three-digit number, maybe property tax, local government distribution. That would be a revenue code number. And then a cost center. Cost centers are optional in both cases. In both cases, whether revenue or appropriation. And the default setting for cost center and UEN is going to be these 4 zeros, meaning there's no cost center, it's null, and it will have no effect on your budgets and your budget account codes. So you'll later on be setting up account codes and revenue codes, but here we've got, in order to include a specific cost center and optional field, we have to have it set up ahead of time before we add the revenue code or the appropriation code. Appropriation codes are comprised of three different required numbers: the fund number, the program number, and the object number. So again, we'll talk about this later in appropriation accounts, but before you can add a customized cost center to that, you would have to set up that cost center first to cost center maintenance, and then when you're setting up your appropriations, add it to that new account code. Again, these three fields are required by your chart of accounts. However, the cost center is completely optional. You do not have to add any cost centers whatsoever if you choose not to. Your appropriation codes are all driven by your chart of accounts, your revenue codes all by the chart of accounts, and they're consistent. So it's again a uniform accounting network. We go back to our overview. Quick definition of cost center. Cost center is a 4-digit number used to subdivide revenue and or appropriation account codes. Cost centers are not required, and emphasize that enough, but are an option to add a greater level of detail for the entity purposes. For example, and only an example, a township that normally uses an appropriation account code for certain road work expenditures might choose to subdivide that appropriation account to show the costs for the work done on Main Street versus High Street separately. The other components of the appropriation code will remain the same, for instance, fund, program, object for that appropriation, but the cost center or centers will differ to distinguish between the costs incurred for each street, between Main and High Street. Now in this example, whatever you use for the fund, program, or object, if it's the same fund, program, and object, and you add a cost center and create two codes instead of one, so you create the same fund, program, object, and then you use a cost center for Main Street and then a cost center for High Street. When your auditors see your year-end reports or when they analyze your data on your annual reports for the audits, they're not going to look at the cost centers. They're not concerned with that. They're concerned with the fund, the program, and the object. So, for instance, if you spend this appropriation code, or if you budget $60,000 for Main Street and $40,000 for High Street, and use the exact same fund, program, and object, but add a different cost center to break it down for your board or council wants to see that the difference in expenses. To see, well, how much we budget 60 for Main Street and 40 for High Street. Let's see now where we're spending the money. For your particular internal purposes, you can do that, but your auditor is just going to look at the total $100,000 budget and whatever expenses that occurred on that $100,000 budget under this fund, program, and object. That's what they're concerned with. So to actually go to our program, if I can find it here, you can see under cost centers, again, accounting, maintenance, cost centers, everyone's going to have this 00 cost center. You cannot remove it. It's the default. And so that'll attach to every account code that you add appropriation or revenue. But you can add a customized one. So let's give you an example. Now you make up the number. You don't have to start at number 1. It's a 4-digit number. Actually, yeah, so I can type in, if I want to start with 5,000, I can start with 5,000. I can call it High Street. And then if I want to call Main Street 6,000, I can call it, enter that in. It's all based on your preference. You can make edits even after attaching the cost center to an appropriation account or a revenue account. You can still make edits to the description. I go to select that account and click on my edit button. I can edit this and include street in the name. You cannot remove the cost centers once they're attached to an appropriation account or a revenue account. You can only activate or deactivate them. Again, we'll talk about that later for the current year. You can activate or deactivate them. But you cannot remove them once there's any activity associated with them. If you attach them to account code, if you set a budget with account code, you can't remove them, but they can be deactivated. And let's see, an important point about this is that this is customizable. As a matter of personal opinion, I don't encourage using these extensively, only for very specific purposes. One of the reasons is, for one thing, if you add a cost center for every account code that you set up in UAN for appropriations and revenues, and you add several cost centers to each of those account codes, remember you're subdividing your account codes. So you're creating more account codes, and as a result, you're creating more line items that you have to budget later on. You'll see when you get a budget, you budget per account code, whether revenue or appropriation. And so you're increasing some additional work and adding an additional level of detail that may not be necessary. And additionally, you want to make sure that you don't use add a cost center for a greater level of detail when that detail is already in the chart of accounts. So you want to really get, when you're converting, you want to really get to know your revenue codes and your appropriation program and object codes before you go adding cost centers. So you want to have a good understanding of this. That way you're really not just attaching a cost center to something that really is covered somewhere else in the chart of accounts. So you want to stay, use this chart of accounts, and then in the rare circumstances where maybe you want to subdivide something out, you can do that. Again, the auditors aren't concerned about cost centers, and they're not going to pay attention to those. They're going to really look at for either your revenue code or for appropriations, your program and your object codes, and analyze your reports that way. Okay, so that's really it for cost centers. We're not going to use cost centers in any of our examples. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those from our list. Well, I'll go ahead and leave Main Street, but no. I'll remove them because they're not in our data sets. And the next chapter is, or section I should say, is on setting up revenue accounts.